You know, there was a time when I think back early in my career where news directors across America really strove to provide balanced and accurate information, particularly about local campaigns, but in general about all campaigns. And the front-running candidates, they were committed to providing balanced news and information about those particular campaigns. And now it seems kind of the opposite. We have news organizations that appear to have a blatant agenda, and in fact, may even endorse a candidate or tout a particular political agenda on the right or the left. And so my question is, thinking back, hearkening back, first of all, did that balance in newsroom really exist, or is it just all of us perhaps hearkening back to some more simple time? And has there now been more of, if you will, a fashionable or acceptable prevalence for news organizations to go one extreme or the other? So first, answer the first part of that question. Was there really balanced news and information in days gone by?
That's a great question, and I think one that, you know, those who follow politics and all of us as viewers and voters still struggle with. But if we look back, you know, I think the answer is always, when you're thinking of objectivity, is subjective, in that, you know, there were some back then who thought that what was, you know, the media, Eastern elite media, which is what it was often derisively called by those who disagreed with it, you know, was fundamentally tilted towards a more moderate to a leftist perspective. However, there were many who look back at that time and say that those involved in it were part of massive corporations and never fundamentally questioned the corporate construct of this country that, you know, often leaves, as we're in deep discussions right here in this campaign, many people behind. So people on the left and the right criticize. What they didn't criticize, and what I think the single biggest difference right now, is that there was a fundamental factual construct that was remarkably similar from major newspapers to the three major networks to, you know, CBS radio, which was more prevalent at that time, and then kind of a fledgling national public radio operation. And there was roiling debate in this country, and those of you, you know, who have memories back to 1968 as an example certainly know that this is not the first time that, you know, we seem to be at each other's throats politically in the United States of America. But generally the arguments were about solutions to problems that people described and understood similarly. Now what you have is fundamentally different construct of facts that are often presented in different media forms. And so sometimes I don't think we even know what we're arguing about in society, and you know, in terms of, you know, who pays taxes in the latest example here and who doesn't pay taxes and all of that. And that's something that's changed a lot. Regardless of what anyone thinks, and it's almost impossible not to have an opinion of Fox News, of MSNBC, just to take two as an example here. Those of you who are out here at the nice, you know, introduction tonight or today, and congratulations on the 40th anniversary of your agency here, and just from a marketing perspective, it's a triumph of brilliant marketing. Let's take a look at Fox News. What they had to do first, and did quite successfully, is not just introduce a news division that had no history, no network parentage, in the same way that MSNBC had NBC as their corporate parent and had well-known news figures that they could kind of move back and forth. But they had to invent all that. But they also had to convince Americans that they had been not just underserved, but ill-served by the mainstream media structure, and that it was so fundamentally tilted to the left that they created, you know, along with talk radio, an audience for this. And perhaps many intuitively felt this way, perhaps others were convinced, but it's been a remarkably successful endeavor for them. And as most of you well know, they're the #1 news network right now, and on most nights double the ratings of CNN, sometimes triple them, you know, from this perspective. That being said, you know, I for one, you know that we'll never go back to what, you know, your former boss, CBS President Les Moonves, called the voice of God anchors, you know, which is Uncle Walter and, you know, Peter Jennings and others. And I think it's very healthy, the amount of information that we have. But I do think this cacophony of conservative and liberal voices and then some in between leaves a lot of voters very ill-informed, and I don't think that's the best thing we have, particularly about 6 weeks before national election.
When you talk about content, I'd also like to ask a couple of questions about political commercials. You know, going back 10, 15, 20 years in media, there was a edict by most news directors that any kind of political advertising be eliminated from newscasts themselves, whether national or local newscasts. Those political advertisements were not allowed within the inventory of that content. And then the creep began, where they first were allowed maybe into the sportscast, and lo and behold, then the weathercast. And before long, that kind of advertising became such a revenue stream for TV stations and networks that suddenly the floodgates opened. And in fact, some laws passed about political advertising from the federal perspective really forced stations to accept more political advertising than maybe many of them from a news coverage standpoint would prefer. So my question to you is, has the inclusion of political advertisements within, I'm talking specifically about TV, but perhaps newspaper and radio as well, impacted the way in which people receive and perceive information about candidates?
I think it's a great question, and I guess, you know, there's the great difficulty, and I teach mass media and politics at the university, and there are some great objective researchers who look at every element of what's happening in politics and in media. The challenge is, it's difficult to impossible to isolate one individual event. So, you know, if I say you're only going to watch local news and you're only going to see these commercials within there, you're a great research subject. But of course, that's not how people live their lives. If you say you're only going to get your information on the internet, you're a great research subject. Unrealistic in many different ways. So the data isn't overly conclusive in terms of how people are getting their electoral information. There is a tremendous amount of data on the differences, and you certainly know this better than I and better than almost anyone in the country, what it can do to the trajectory of a television station. Stations increasingly count on this as a major revenue source. And we here in Minnesota, as you're well aware, you know, we see presidential political ads on the news, covered as a news story. Occasionally see them because Wisconsin is considered a swing state, especially with Representative Ryan now on the Republican ticket. But in general, with Minnesota having the longest streak of states that has gone Democratic, it's really not in play according to the polls, so we get very few presidential campaign ads. Conversely, you know, if you happen to be driving through Ohio in the next month, I suggest, you know, 2 words: Barnes and Noble. Stay away from the television. You will be shocked at how many spots. And as you well know, Susan, it used to not only be, well, we may have them in sports, then into weather, and then it's the whole news. There used to be a separation from ads, and now they just string into each other. And I would argue, you know, there's a lot of talk right now. The story of media and politics today is, it appears that Governor Romney has a little less money than anticipated. President Obama might have a little more money than anticipated. But boy, I think with most people, with so many ads in these swing states, it becomes audiovisual wallpaper. And, you know, I'm just not sure how much of a breakthrough impact it can have unless they're really compelling narratives or arguments, or unless there's a significant gaffe, and then it gets covered as a news item anyway.
A dirty secret in this period between now and the election, a lot of TV stations actually collapse the amount of content, so they have more time to collect advertising and the revenue from that. You called it cacophony before, which I think is an interesting word to describe all the sea of information that's out there. Do you think any one of us can get the real scoop on any candidate and where he or she stands from the media at this point?
I do, and I think that the good news right now is that, you know, this cacophony at least has some very clear voices, and they're in every media form, and they can be found. You know, if you watch, and I say this respectfully to a lot of local and national news organizations or cable news networks, but watch the NewsHour on PBS, which moves away from every construct of cable news in terms of, they don't get the loudest people in the room, they get the smartest people in the room, if not the planet, on a certain issue. It's remarkable the depth and breadth of experts that they have that can analyze a candidate's position or occasionally, but not overdo, the actual horse race aspect of it. There's some great analysis online, especially when it's backed up by major media organizations that would report this in a magazine or a newspaper or a television or radio station. And certainly there's some opinion journalism, and I would argue, perhaps self-servingly, because this is how we do it at the Star Tribune, when you read an editorial in the Star Tribune, agree with it or not. If you agree, I wrote it. If it's not, it's my boss. Right? He's the editor. So. But you read an editorial, the amount of research and reporting that goes in before you're writing is something that people really should know. Whereas a lot of opinion, especially online, is strictly that. It's opining and it's gut feel. Some of it can seem to be very accurate, but it's not necessarily data-driven or fact-driven or backed up by talking to key people involved. So I think that you can indeed get very good information. The challenge is, of course, candidates from both parties often do things demonstrably different from what they said that they would. So, you can be the most informed voter possible, and then they come into office and they have a different agenda at times.
Speaking of being demonstratively different, what about these aggressive political trackers, those vigilantes that stalk all candidates and then pull excerpts that can really harm a person's campaign? What are your thoughts on that and that tactic as campaign strategy?
Sadly, it's not going to go away, and if anything, it used to be where they had these campaign trackers where they were very identifiable. So you might be out on the hustings and making a speech, and if I were the tracker from the rival candidacy, you not only would get used to me, you might get to know me. I'd be almost part of the campaign infrastructure. There are long stories of very generous candidates from both parties who have the opposition's trackers, and they feed them and they help move them along, and they realize that this is part of the process. But nowadays, as we just saw with Governor Romney, and as we saw 4 years ago with then Senator Obama, everyone's a tracker. Because everyone and anyone can not only quote or fabricate, if they want to, what someone said, but all of us, and I think most of us in this room have some device somewhat similar to this, can record either audio or video or both. So certainly Governor Romney wishes, as he said, that he hadn't said his comments, which he himself called inelegant, and Senator Obama still is dogged by his comments about people often in rural regions, his words, not mine, bitter, and quote, clinging to guns and religion, end quote, as something that could have seriously derailed. And I think important here as well, that's a no-cost way, to upload a video on YouTube and derail a multi-million-dollar, sometimes hundreds of $1 million of candidacy or campaign ads, that are running here. But I think that the most insidious aspect of this is look at this good room and look at all the introductions that we have and look at people's level of accomplishment, and clearly the sense I get from being in here is how important service is to their community and to their fellow Minnesotan here. How many people want to live like this, where the only truly private moment you have is completely behind closed doors? And so for both parties, this is not a partisan statement, it's an American one, I really fear we're chasing great leaders, and we need them in both parties, away from the political process, because most people cannot live their lives like that.